Um,
Yeah, that's in full presentation mode now.
okay, great. Thank you for that tip. And I'm so sorry. I'm usually actually better at Zoom than this. So, but now it seems we've got the audio working and the slides. So let me just go forward. Um, all right. So talking about IDC, again, it might be review for some of you. Hopefully you'll get some new information as well. So, today, I'd like to focus on indirect costs, what they are, how our indirect cost rate is determined, what happens to these IDC funds that are received at City College. And I'd also like to talk about sort of some proposed models for indirect costs that are being discussed right now because of the president's proposal or executive orders, which have sought to reduce our indirect costs to 15%. If we have time, we'll talk about the federal budget process. So just a little bit about the budgetary process generally, what the current proposed budget is for funding agencies, and then you know, what is a continuing resolution and how might that affect us? Okay, so this is from the Code of Federal Regulations. So I'm just going to say it's clear as mud what indirect costs are from this description, but I'll just give you a second to look at it. Essentially, what it's saying is that indirect costs, which are often referred to as facilities and administrative costs, mean those costs that are incurred for a common or joint purpose, benefiting more than one cost objective, and not readily assignable to the cost objective specifically benefited. Okay, again, like I said, clear as mud. Let's look at another definition of what indirect costs are. So this is the NSF definition of indirect costs. So indirect costs are those costs which are not readily identifiable with a particular cost objective, such as a particular activity or project, but nevertheless are necessary for the general operation of an organization. So some examples of indirect costs include salaries, and related expenses of individuals working in accounting, personnel, purchasing functions, rent, depreciation of buildings, and utilities. So typically, organizations charge indirect costs to federal awards by developing and applying an indirect cost rate, which is usually consistent across. So once you have an indirect cost rate, your F&A rate is applied to all federal awards. It doesn't actually go beyond, it's usually a federally negotiated rate, so it doesn't go beyond the federal awards. Um, and so what this really means, like all of this language, is sort of that there are certain functions at the university, let's say, that support all research awards. They're not readily assignable to one award. And so that's where we get into the indirect cost language or what indirect costs are. Um, so when we're thinking about indirect costs and we're thinking about what that recovery might be on awards, it's dependent on several factors. And I've just listed a few here for you. So one, of course, is it depends on the type of rate. Is it a provisional or a determined rate? Here at City College of New York, we have a predetermined rate. So that is something that was negotiated with the federal agency. Typically, these rates are negotiated with the agency or the department or the division that gives us the most funding. So most recently, our federal rate was negotiated with the Department of Health and Human Services. Um, and so what is negotiated is actually a percentage rate. So for CCNY, that percentage rate is 57% for all federal agencies. Um, and then we also have to think about the application based. So that's sort of like what is the pot of money that we're going to base the indirect costs on. And so, so let me just say a few things. One, the predetermined rate is not is a fixed rate. And it shouldn't be able to be negotiated. It's negotiated for a particular period of time. So typically the indirect cost rates are negotiated for 3 to 4 years at least. And so as you all probably know, so these efforts to reduce our indirect cost rate to 15% are actually something that they're trying to impose without paying proper respect to the time period for which we negotiated our rate, right? So that's one of the reasons or one of the bases for the lawsuits that are being brought forward by the various agencies. Okay, so in terms of the application base, I think it's important to say that indirect costs are not charged on everything that you put onto your proposal budget. So when we'll talk about, that's the next slide, I'll tell you about what is or what is not available for being charged for an indirect cost. But I'll also mention that the indirect costs themselves and the rates can be award dependent. So certain awards will have less of a rate than other awards. And that is sometimes dependent on the sponsoring agency. Foundations also typically have a different rate than let's say federal agencies. So the source of the funding will also determine the amount of indirect costs that can be charged. Oh, and actually, while we're just talking here or chatting, I just wanted to say, like, if you have a question, feel free to interrupt me at any time. This is meant to be more of a discussion than a little lecture from me. So yeah, please feel free to interrupt and ask questions. Okay, so when we're talking about that application base, sometimes a phrase that is commonly used is modified total direct costs. So these would be the costs that you put onto so your direct costs are things that you put on your budget to support your research project. And that can include things like salaries and wages for personnel, the appropriate fringe benefits, materials and supplies, any services that you need to purchase in order to do your work, travel, sub awards, and subcontracts. So those are all direct costs that we would consider when we're calculating the indirect costs. I will say for subawards and subcontracts, it's only to a particular dollar value that they're considered direct costs and then they're not considered. So underneath the rubric of modified total direct costs, things like equipment, capital expenditures, rental costs, tuition remission, scholarship and fellowships, participant support costs like stipends are excluded from the indirect cost calculation. So, and again, for the NSF anyway, subawards and subcontract expenses above 50,000 are excluded from consideration for indirect cost calculation. So this is kind of it's kind of a silly example of how to think about indirect costs, but I think it's also informative as well. It's developed by this joint associations group that has come forward with this FAIR model, which I'll talk about later. So ignore the FAIR model thing over, oops. Oh my goodness, that was not supposed to happen. So ignore the FAIR model thing all the way on over here, and let's just focus on these things here, and hopefully you can see my mouse. Okay, so if you go out for dinner, you get a traditional bill, right, where you've gotten, like in this case, chips and salsa, Caesar salad, some soda, some porterhouse steak, and carrot cake. Um, I see Marla has a question. Do you want to go ahead, Marla?
Sorry, I just want to go back to the subaward 50K.
Mm-hmm.
Um, are we implementing that, or because I know we usually do 25K? Because I know
Oh,
with the updated CFR, it's it's that 50K, the expenses above 50K.
yeah. So, yeah, maybe Latoya can comment on that. I'll just say that's what I saw on the NSF website, so that's what I
Yes,
grabbed.
awesome.
But Latoya, maybe you can shed some light.
Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so because our negotiated rate was applied before the before the NSF came up with the 50K, well, it's not really the NSF, but the CFR, the new federal guidance came into effect. Our rate was negotiated at the time when it was $25,000 for subawards. So when our new rate will be negotiated, which is I think the next 5 years or 3 years, I'm not sure when it's going to be renegotiated. That's when the 50K will be applied. But until our rate expires and we have a new negotiated rate, that's when the 50K become effective.
Oh, perfect. And I'm just going to say to all of you that I didn't know this either. So we're all learning here today. Thank you, Latoya.
You're welcome.
But yeah, so this is 25K for us now, but when we renegotiate our rate, it will change. So perfect. Okay, let's go back to our simple way to talk about indirect costs. So again, we're all out for dinner. We're getting lots of food. We get the bill. It looks fine. You'll notice that the bill does not include anything like the rent on the restaurant, the cost for the chef, for the waiters, for the personnel involved, for any of the furniture in the restaurant, right? None of that, the refrigerators that house the food, none of that is included in your bill, right? And so what you presume, what most of us, I think, presume is that the price of the food is actually incorporating some of those costs, which are not obvious and they're not related to any of these things directly or to your meal directly, but they are supporting your meal at this restaurant, right? Um, so another way to look at it is like if we had the indirect costs for restaurants, then we would have the same food, and you'll see that the prices are lower now because they're reflecting the actual price of the item. And then we have the indirect costs, which is sort of taking into account all of those infrastructure things that supported basically you having your meal at the restaurant, right? And so another way that we can look at this is to now look at this over here where we sort of break out all of these different things. So there's now a steak aging room. I'm not even really sure what that means, but you'll all trust me that like it's something to do with eating steak. Um, but oh, sorry again. Um, there's the brick pizza oven, the seafood tank, right? Those are all the things that are needed to support your meal. And so one of the things that I just, and then of course there's things like the electricity, the rent, the staff, laundry, whatever. Um, but one of the things I want to point out to you is that in this model, right, where we're sort of breaking out the costs, what you can see is though, even though this person only had steak, right, they had the porterhouse steak, they didn't have pizza, they didn't have the seafood, they're still, their bill is still paying for those items, right? Because all of those items are needed at the restaurant to support putting the food on the table. So that's really actually kind of how we think about the indirect costs. So we use the indirect costs to support all of the research infrastructure here at City College and or just generally. And they're not specific to your particular research um, project. So now here's the actual sort of more real, shall I say, diagram of how we can think about indirect and direct costs. So over here, I'm going to try to use my mouse again. Hopefully I won't change the slide. But here is where we consider the direct costs. So again, these are the costs for salaries, for stipends, project-specific lab supplies and equipment, travel costs for either conducting the research or sharing and publishing your results, and other very focused on the research activities that you can directly attribute to that one project. Now let's think about all of the other things that are needed to support your research project. So some of the F&A costs that we can talk about. So here, this is meant to represent the personnel who support your research project. So those would be the people involved in security, the financial aspects, the administrative aspects, technical, maintenance, janitorial staff, okay? Then over here, this is meant to represent the costs that are associated with either, let's say, hazardous waste, if you use radiation, that radiation safety, chemical safety, safety training, hazardous waste disposal, those things come under indirect costs. Other things that come under indirect costs are, this is a room full of servers, okay? So it's costs associated with data storage, with access to the internet, telecommunications, your high-speed computing, data processing, and things like that. Library and research facilities would also be covered under indirect costs, as well as, and this is an important one, I think, for us, specialized core facilities and shared research lab equipment. Those are other things that are supported through indirect costs, as well as costs associated with sort of general maintenance of the building, like utilities, ventilation, heat, air conditioning, water, and so on. Now, there are additional costs associated with sort of regulatory compliance. So we have compliance requirements from federal, state, and local agencies, and that includes both security requirements as well as like looking at things like conflict of interest reporting and human boards and animal safety. So for those of you who use animals in your research, this would be like the animal care and use review boards and things like that. Okay, so you may want to know, so hopefully that was clear. Maybe I'll just pause for a second and make sure that everybody feels comfortable with sort of our definitions of indirect and direct costs and what comes under each category. I will say that because the indirect costs are not specific to a particular project, but rather support all projects, we do think about them in these pools, right? So like in terms of personnel, compliance related or regulation related, safety related, and so on. Okay, so not hearing any questions. I'm going to move on to talk a little bit about how do we get what is considered when we're thinking about figuring out the rate for the indirect costs. So this is from the Code of Federal Regulations. You heard LaToya mention it before, the CFR. All grants offices kind of live and die by what the CFR says. So this is about the determination of the IDC rate for nonprofit organizations or institutes of higher education. So if this organization or institute receives more than $10 million, then the costs have to be broken down into facilities and administration. So for institutes of higher ed, when we think about facilities, that's the depreciation on the buildings, equipment, and capital improvements. There's interest on the debt associated with certain buildings, equipment, capital improvements, operation and maintenance expenses, library expenses. Operation expenses that include the maintenance of the physical plant mean things like building repairs, furniture and equipment, the care of grounds, the maintenance and operation of buildings, security, environmental safety, some of the things we've already mentioned before. And you can see how they would build up. Administration is sort of general administration and general expenses. So again, this is sort of finance aspects, the grants office, support the grants office, accounting, personnel, and other expenses which would not be listed under facilities, but under general administration of the research infrastructure. Oh, so actually, before we move on, so I guess we said it already, but our rate was negotiated a couple of years ago, and our federally negotiated rate is 57%. And as you heard from Latoya, we'll have to renegotiate that well, we're scheduled to renegotiate it in 2 to 3 years. Hopefully that will in fact happen. Okay, so now this is maybe the information that all of you wanted, but let's talk very specifically about how things are happening here at City College. So this is sort of looking at two things. So this is total grants and contracts per year. So sort of like research awards that we're getting every year. And also research expenditures, which is how much we're spending out. So in FY25, so that's fiscal year 25, which ended on June 30th, 2025, our total research awards and contracts were on the order of $93 million. But I think you can see here, I am really hoping I don't advance the slide. Okay, but here we have this 1 point. That's FY24, where we were up to 99 million in terms of our total research grants, research awards and contracts. So the higher number in FY24 can reflect a couple of different things. One of which is that sometimes an award, the whole award is given at once, whereas expenditures will occur on a yearly basis, right? So somebody gets a 3-year or 4-year award from the NSF and they get all the money at once, as opposed to every year. And so that's one way that the number can be inflated or different from our research expenditures. I think, unfortunately, probably the reason why FY24 was a better year for us than FY25 has probably more to do with the fact that many of our grants were terminated this past year, and one in particular from the Department of Transportation, which was quite a large grant, and so it did impact our total research award and contract number. That's what's shown in the purple squares. Our total research expenditures is how much we spend on research over the year. And that is actually the number that is used for calculating the indirect costs. So in fact, we actually have to spend money in order to recover the indirect cost amount. We don't just get it, right? We have to spend the money to get it. So for example, right now, while we're in this federal shutdown and nobody is spending any money, we're also not generating any indirect costs, just to say. Okay, so in FY25, so you can...
Sorry, just one thing there, Ishita, with there a caveat there that we are spending money on salary, right?
Yes. Well, we're still, and so interestingly, right now, we're still able to draw down from the NIH, the NSF, from all these federal agencies, even though there's a shutdown. I think when we run out of the appropriated money, we'll be in trouble because there won't be any more appropriations. But right now, yes, people are still getting paid. Nobody's not getting paid. But we've been asked by RF not to spend so much on like materials and supplies, for example, things
Yeah.
like that, or to hire new people, right?
Yeah,
Because
that's clear. Yeah.
we're in the
Yeah.
shutdown. But yes, thank you for that clarification. That, yeah, people are still being paid. So let's not worry about that. Regardless, just to say, so looking at the research expenditures, which are here in the blue circles, you can see that that has been tracking our total grants awards, total awards and contracts pretty well until FY24. And we're still going up in FY25. So FY25, we spent about $82 million on research expenditures. FY24, this number is roughly 77 million. I will say that, you know, these things track, right? And you can see that very clearly in this graph. So as we get further on, the research expenditures will go down as as the grants and contracts also go down, right? And so there'll be a bit of a lag, but I do think that if you know, if some of the things like continue as they are, we might see a decrease in research expenditures going forward because of the shutdown, because of limited funding rates, and so on. Hopefully it won't be as bad as we might imagine. And just to say, here at the grants office, we are happy to help you to put your research proposals together. And we have been thinking a lot about how do we reframe your proposals so they're competitive in this current environment. So my message to you is like, let's keep writing grants, let's keep trying to get awards, and we're here to help you with that. So then here, what we're looking at now is our total IDC received over the same time period. So we're talking, actually, sorry, I didn't point this out before, but we're talking over the past 10 years from 2015 up to 2025. So here we're looking at the total IDC, and you can see, and it's actually, I feel a little bit maybe more clear here than in the other graphs, but you can see that the IDC was starting to go up, and then we had the pandemic, right? And so everything went down during that time. Grant funding was low, and then now it's been going up again. So here's 2025, where we received almost 14 million in IDC. We can look at the sort of percentage that we're receiving of IDC. So this is where we look at the IDC received relative to the research expenditures. So I know that many of you are good with math, and you're going to be like, yeah, because 14 million is not 57% of the 82 million research expenditures, right? And so if we look at that rate, so that's something that we can call the effective rate here at City College. Well, it's the effective rate for everybody here at City College. Our effective rate is around 17 to 18%. You can see that it has stayed relatively flat over the years since about 2017, where we're just sort of hovering between 18 and 16%.
Now, Ishita, I have a question.
Mhm.
The 13 million that IDC received, is City College that received, or the whole county, RF County?
No, that is what City College receives.
Because I know the RF County deducts some, so the net comes to City College, correct?
Right. Yes.
So this is
So
after those things deducted. Okay.
no, it's not. This is the this is the total. We'll get into how the IDC is spent in a second.
Okay.
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 We'll come back to that. That's a really good question, and it's actually the next slide. But let me just finish with this first, just to say that our effective rate here, again, is around 17 to 18%. So why is the effective rate lower than our actual sort of negotiated rate? So a couple of different reasons for that. One big reason is that not all grants are federal grants. So New York City and New York State uses different rates. Foundations, in fact, tend not to use the federal rate at all. They often will have a 0% IDC or at best 15%. Other types of grants, such as education grants from the Department of Education or training grants, also tend to have lower rates, lower IDC rates than the federal rate. So that's another instance where we're not getting the 57%. And so you can see cumulatively at City College, our rate is actually more, again, in the 17% range than in the 57% range.
Do we know what the NYC and NYS rates are?
I think they're a little bit more grant specific, but maybe Latoya, I know you're on the call. Do you have a number for people?
So it depends. For some New York City agencies, it's 10%. Some New York State agency, it varies. Like for New York State Department of Education and Department of Health, it's 20%. So it varies across the agencies, city and state.
Okay.
Great. Thank you, Latoya. Okay, so let's now get to Reza's question. Which is perhaps interesting for everybody, but where do we spend this IDC money? How do we spend it at City College? And so there's sort of three big buckets where we spend this money. And the biggest bucket is actually research administration. So there, first, we send money to CUNY Central. That's in the form of the central allocation budget. So that is funding that goes to CUNY Central, and they use those funds to support the research enterprise that we also take advantage of. So, for example, at CUNY Office of Research, they also have regulation and compliance people, right? And they do have some seed funding for us and things like that. A really big place where a lot of our money goes is to pay Research Foundation. So every transaction that happens with your grants is charged a fee by Research Foundation. Well, almost every transaction. And so those fees are paid for out of IDC. And the RF fees go to support RF, right? Because they have all these people working there and they need to be able to support them, to pay their salaries, for example, as well as for the software, for the infrastructure that they need to exist. We pay around over, I should say, $5 million in RF fees per year. Other areas where we spend money is on the grants office, and then some of these regulatory things that we need to do, like the Institutional Review Board and Animal Care and Use. So that's where some of the other funding goes. We spend about $7.7 million in research administration every year. Other areas where we spend money is in faculty support. So one of the main drivers for that is the IDC return, where we're returning about $0.8 million, a little bit more than $0.8 million to institutes and individuals here at City College. So you get an IDC return based on the amount of IDC that we receive from your efforts. Other areas where we spend money is faculty startups. So we spend, this past year, we spent about $1 million, but going forward, we're going to be hiring lots of new faculty in science and engineering, and I imagine that that number will increase as we go forward. We also spend money on matching commitments. So when you prepare your proposals and you say, oh, we're going to have an institutional cost share, that cost share is often coming from our IDC. Depends on what it is, but often it's coming from the IDC. We also spend money on bridge funding and travel funding. So this past year, fiscal year 25, because we had a number of grant terminations, we did spend quite a bit in bridge funding to help people whose grants were suddenly terminated. So finally, other areas, the other big bucket where we spend money is in research infrastructure. So you can see here, that's about $1.1 million. That includes core facilities. So that's all of the instrumentation, the shared instrumentation, as well as those of you who work in CDI will know that we've been spending a lot of time and money fixing cold rooms. That is part of what we spend our IDC on. There are also the service centers and student support. So we support summer students, we support some of the PhD students, and that's reflected in that research infrastructure number. So let me pause here, I think, because this is really probably the most important slide for some of you. But this is sort of an explanation of where we spend the money for the IDC.
Yes, this Jimmy. With respect to the central allocation budget, who decides what that amount should be?
That's such a great question. And I think we've asked, and Rose Wesson, who is our current AVP, said she didn't know how that number was determined. So she doesn't know. I know even less about how that number is determined. But yeah.
And do we know if the goods that we get in return from them are commensurate with our level of participation?
We
Or
don't
is
know
this
that.
spread out all over CUNY?
It's so every CUNY school is contributing to this central allocation budget. But I imagine that our contributions are scaled relative to like our research expenditures or our IDC received.
Okay, thanks.
I have a question.
Mhm.
I mean, you mentioned the IDC was 13.968 million.
Mhm.
If I add up this number, the research administrations and faculty and research infrastructure, it's not 13.98.
No,
So where
no.
does the rest go?
Well, and I didn't put everything on this list. There's still many more things that are supported through IDC. These are kind of the biggest areas that are supported, but there are other aspects of the college that are supported through IDC, as well as some seed funding and things like that. So, yeah, this is about 80% of what is received goes to these three areas.
So I mean, me, and us and you don't know, we don't know where the other, what, 2 million goes.
Well, I mean, no, I could tell you where it goes, but it's like it becomes much smaller pockets of money, right? So it's not, like
Yeah.
we're not talking, nobody's getting millions out of the, like
Yeah.
it's just, so that's why. But it's really, it's still going for most of these same things. There are some faculty-wide, like campus-wide salaries that are supported by IDC, like for security and safety. I think I didn't list here, but like we pay for hazardous waste, things like that that come up. They're not as large as these amounts, so I didn't list them all.
Okay.
Other questions?
What is IDC return?
What is IDC return? That's
Yeah.
your drop funds.
Okay, drive fund.
Yes.
Thank you.
Our local parlance, it's drop funds. All right, so let's move forward. So what I wanted to touch upon now was this new model for IDC, which is the Financial Accountability in Research, or FAIR model. this model was developed in response to the executive orders or proclamations about changing the federal IDC rates to 15%. Again, I'm like, and so this this model was developed by a group of organizations. And I'll say, I think many of you, if you're paying attention to the news, you know that this 15% thing has not gone forward. And it's because several of these organizations that are listed here have brought lawsuits to stop the implementation of the 15% rate. And so they have been successful, but it's not clear. I think I would be fair for me to say that it's not clear if, you know, this change will be affected or not. I think it's still sort of in the courts. And so we're all just kind of waiting to know what's going to happen. Regardless, these are the organizations that have worked together to come up with this FAIR model. They're called the Joint Association Groups. And they're led by Kelvin Drogemeyer, who many of you might remember. He was the director of the Office of Science and Technology Policy under President Trump during his first term. So Kelvin has contacts in Congress. He's been talking to OMB. So I think that is why people think that this model might gain some legs, but I don't know. We'll see. It's not clear. None of this is clear now. We're all in the age of uncertainty. Okay, so back. Okay, so what are some of the ideas that they had when they were developing this model? They wanted it to be a common sense approach to figuring out these research indirect costs that ensures transparency, accountability, simplicity. So, and they want to make sure that we fund the actual costs of research, potentially linking them to individual projects, as well as they think that it will create efficiency and savings because it'll reduce complexity and the administrative workload. So here are some of the aspects of the model. Again, that it would be accountable. They want it to be acceptable to the research community, that's simple, fair. Again, some of the things I've already mentioned. And I'll just say that the community would like this to go forward. But in thinking about that, their idea is that it will take a while to implement. So once this is adopted, it would take a couple of years to implement. And they really do feel like the entire academic or research community has to be behind this model in order for it to be accepted. So that's some of their goals of this group. Okay, so we're back to the restaurant model or the restaurant example where we had moved to sort of thinking about the explicit charging here. So I'm just going to come back to this receipt where we got to see how much we were being charged for some of the things that we would normally maybe would have considered as indirect costs. And so we have the specific costs for the different things that are needed for the food, and then kind of a generic percentage rate for these other costs like electricity and credit card system and so on. So one thing about the FAIR model is that rather than paying for so again, like this person only had the porterhouse steak, they didn't have any seafood, they didn't have any pizza. So rather than paying for those things that they didn't use, now they're only paying for the sort of infrastructure on the steak aging room, which again, no one is clear what that actually means. But so they're not paying for the brick oven or for the seafood. And so that's sort of the idea behind the FAIR model is that one, that we start to break out all of these costs and list them explicitly. And then you don't include costs that are not appropriate for your research. So if I'm doing research in computer science, I don't necessarily need to pay for the infrastructure for some lab facilities, for example. So, okay, so just some other key points of the model. It's clear that indirect costs are not really indirect at all. They're real costs that need to be paid for. So in the restaurant analogy, you can't have your meal without having electricity and the staff to provide it. So these are essential costs, essential resources. But so one of the complaints about indirect costs in the past has been that they're not transparent, right? We don't know where they go. We don't know how they're charged. And so one of the key ideas behind the FAIR model is to make these costs more transparent to anyone. Pay the actual costs. You don't pay for what you don't use. And another key point that they like to make is that the costs are easily auditable. So we know where things are going. We know where the costs are being taken from. Okay, so this is what this would actually look like, where here we have the research performance costs. So this is what you would normally be filling out for your proposal budget, right? So it's how much you're paying your senior key personnel, your other personnel, how much you need for supplies, publication costs, travel, and so on. So this part remains essentially the same. What starts to happen down here is when we're starting to think about this essential research performance support. And I'll just say there are a few different models of this FAIR model, depending on the type of institution that you are. So for smaller schools, really small schools, they wouldn't necessarily break out all of these costs. They wouldn't be so detailed. I think for City College, we're probably looking at a situation where we would want to break out all of these costs in a real way, rather than just using some percentage or values determined by somebody else. So what would we break out? Well, there's regulatory compliance. Again, this is things like the IRB or the IACUC, animal care and use, conflict of interest, all of our sort of compliance, regulatory compliance things that we need to do. There's award monitoring, oversight, and reporting. This we are thinking would be some of the work of the grants office, as well as our costs associated with Research Foundation. There are essential research performance facilities, which one can think of as a percent of the budget. And again, that might be the library. Well, actually, sorry, the next line, research information services would be like the library, what we use for the internet. These essential research performance facilities would be a percentage of the budget, and is related to things that are not easily classifiable, like hazardous waste removal or something like that. And general research operations would also be a percentage of a budget. And that can even be maintenance of buildings and such, where the particular cost is not readily assignable to one particular grant.
Hi,
So-
Ishita, sorry to interrupt.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm following this and it makes sense, but I'm stuck on a question going back to where the money goes. If you could just clarify one thing for me, it would really help. So you said how much of our IDC goes to RF fees versus the other bucket in that one? I mean, we all need RF to do things, right? So like our IDC is paying for their employment, right?
Yeah.
And so,
I mean,
right.
yeah.
And so that's a critical bit. But did you say of that 7.7 that's research administration, most of it is going to central allocation budget, or is most of it going to RF fees?
Most of it is going to RF fees.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, that's reasonable. Okay, sorry. Yeah, I just was caught on that. That's great.
Yeah,
Thanks.
No. It's about 5 million in
Is for
RF.
the
Yeah.
All right, terrific. Thanks for that clarification.
It's central allocation is on the order of 500,000 to 750,000.
All right, terrific. Yeah, thanks a lot.
Sure, no problem. And like I said, like feel free to interrupt. I'm not gonna. I think we will not do the budget because we're running out of time today. So we'll just stick with this FAIR model and just talk about it for a second. So again, like when we're thinking about these costs, so when we talked about regulatory compliance, then these are the costs associated with conducting federally funded research. So we're talking about costs associated with having animal or human subjects, radiation safety, biosafety, clinical trial monitoring, which doesn't affect us, or specialized data security, right? There's the award monitoring, oversight and reporting. So project-specific costs associated with financial and non-financial management. So in this case, if we were putting a budget together using this FAIR model, we would probably include the RF costs, the RF fees, some estimate of what they're going to cost into the AMOR category. Then there's the essential research performance facilities, which are the project-specific costs associated with the type of space that's used. So maintenance, utilities, operations, building depreciation, leases. These are all things that are already included when we figure out that IDC rate, but now they would be calculated as a percent of the budget that you submit. And then research information services, as I mentioned, would be like journal subscription, sort of the library things, database access, institutional repositories, and things like that. So, yeah, so that's sort of the FAIR model. We have about 5 minutes left. I think I'll just open it to questions rather than diving deep into the budget. Unless I guess I hear from all of you that you really want to talk about the budget. Um, but I'm happy to just pause here and answer any questions that you might have. As mentioned, I'd like to say that going forward, I think Office of Research will be having these brown bag lunches more often. And one of the things that's going to make it work is to keep them to an hour so that it's not too much of your time, which is why I'm not going through all the budgetary stuff right now. But again, I'm happy to answer any questions you might have about what I've presented thus far. And maybe I'll stop my share. Okay.
Well, if nobody else has questions, I have another one.
Okay, go for it.
So with the breakdown of the money spent by CCNY, who's deciding that? Is that your office or is that the provost's office?
So my office is in the provost office, to be clear. So yeah, I mean, I think it's a cumulative sort of decision with respect to nothing is really decided without the provost. But he obviously is not deciding every decision because that would be a lot. But any big outlays of funding are provost decision or our combined decision.
Okay. And then follow up on that, you mentioned that some money that's in this faculty support bucket is used on matching commitments. And I'm curious there how the college decides when to do that and when not to do that. And that's for me, that seems like a place where a lot of transparency would be needed because matching funds opens up a whole different set of proposals that I've never written.
Well, so for sure, something like an MRI proposal in the old days used to require an institutional contribution, right, of at least 30%. So that's the type of award that might need a matching commitment. sometimes the matching commitment is done through people's time.
Yeah, that's what we just did in a recent proposal.
Right. So then you're talking about release time, but somebody's got to pay for that release time, right? So that can sometimes come back to IDC. So we
Yeah,
use that for that.
we actually like just leverage faculty 9 months salary and call that, and NYSERDA agrees that that's a way to do it.
Oh,
But
okay.
I'm really I mean the fact that there's money out there for matching funds is new to me. This is the first time I've heard this.
Oh, well, I didn't think I was changing policy, but there is funding for matching funds. Yeah, no. I think, within reason, I think it often, to be completely transparent here, it's also how much of the match is also going to be dependent on how much like comes in, right? So it can't be that we're outlaying more than we're getting in. We kind of want it to be an even situation.
Got
Maybe
it.
I'll say that and leave it at that. But yeah, no, we're happy to do matching funds or to try to help you. I mean, I think that, my overall message would be, and this was going to be when we were talking about the budget for sure, that we want you to go forward in putting proposals together. We have a new director of proposal development who can help you with, sort of putting the proposal together. We have a fabulous grants office who helps you with all the logistics of putting your proposal together and getting it submitted, and as well as post-award support. So we are encouraging you to continue to submit proposals. We're happy to support you. Our goal is to support research on campus. Um, so yeah, so go
Thanks.
forth.
No, this is really useful.
Oh,
So one last thing, and it's relevant to the bridge funding. So I have a colleague who has 5 proposals submitted, waiting to hear back on them, and PhD students. Should I encourage him to reach out to your office about bridge funding, or who do they approach?
yes, we have a link on our site,
Okay,
which actually I'm just scared to do it because I've been having so many Zoom problems. So maybe Melina can put it in the chat. But we do have a link on our site to the bridge funding. So you can take a look at that. There information about applying. There
great.
was a CUNY bridge funding program where we were providing half of the funds and CUNY was providing the other half of the funds. Um, and that program is now ended. CUNY has stopped providing their share, but we are still providing bridge funding. So that's something that's still going on.
Okay, terrific. Well, thanks. Sorry for taking over the question, Q&A.
No, it's perfect. We needed somebody to ask questions, so thank you for that. Any other questions? If not, we will be, I think, posting this brown bag lunch discussion on our website. So you will be able to go back, either look at the slides or look at the whole thing. And yeah, and if you don't feel comfortable asking a question here, you feel free to reach out to me directly and I'll be happy to work with you, answering your question. Or as I mentioned, Grants Office, Office of Research are happy to work with you on your proposals. Um, and I look forward to seeing you in person or perhaps at the next brown bag. And thank you all for joining. I'll see you
Thanks
soon.
very much.
Yeah, take care, everybody.
Thank you.